Welcome, everyone, once again to the Roundtable, the Editors and Publishers podcast at the American Mind. I am your host, Ryan Williams, president of the Claremont Institute and publisher of the American Mind and the Claremont Review of Books. I am joined by Mike Sabo, managing editor of the American Mind, and a special guest today, Josh Treviño, who wears a couple of hats, both at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, but also at America First Policy Institute, where he's in charge of their Western Hemisphere project. So we thought we'd want Josh on today to talk through Venezuela. Of course, how could we not talk about Venezuela and the operation over the weekend, and what it means for the region, what it means for America's foreign policy and strategic positioning, what it means for the Trump administration going forward, and how we should understand all of it. Josh has been studying Latin America and the geopolitical implications of Latin America for most of his adult career, among his other interests, knows the region very well, speaks and writes Spanish, always useful in studying these things. So, Josh, welcome, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you. I want to add that I speak and write Spanish only in the context of sufficiency for South Texas, which is insufficient for most of the rest of the hemisphere.
Well, yeah, it's good enough for government work, right? Almost.
There you go. Absolutely.
Yeah, I wanted to start broadly. I think most of our listeners and watchers, if not all, none of them really live under a rock, so they know that Operation Absolute Resolve, as it's called, involved the overnight raid and acquisition of President Nicolás Maduro from Venezuela without a single American life lost, in somewhat dramatic fashion, a very interesting and sophisticated and really peerless display of American special operator prowess. So they know about all that, but how should we understand, I think to start, how should we understand the strike in a regional context? I mean, the legal imprimatur for this is the indictment in the Southern District of New York of Nicolás Maduro for drug trafficking. But I think everyone knows that that's the cover to a much larger purpose behind all this.
Yeah, and thank you for having me on. I think this is a good venue to discuss a lot of the aspects of this raid and the context around it that really haven't been discussed elsewhere. And exactly to your point, there's a lot of chatter about the putative legality, which I think is mostly a spurious conversation. There is some basis to it, but a lot less than those who were keenly interested in it seem to think. This is really a fundamental question of statecraft that drove the United States to do this. And we should emphasize that there were years, too many years, of strategic patience on the parts of American policymakers. Some of it was through apathy and complacency, and some of it was simply through, a desire to let all alternatives play out before you got Chinooks over Caracas. But to your point, the indictment that we see in the Southern District of New York for Nicolás Maduro and I believe his wife Celia it's not a pretext, but it's only one piece in the puzzle. What we have seen across the past generation emerge in Latin America specifically, and in other parts of the world too, but in Latin America, obviously, we have a much more immediate concern versus other parts of the world, is what I've been calling the Estado de Narco. It's the Narco-States synthesis. This cartel state synthesis that characterizes a lot of the governments in the region in ways that are qualitatively new. I mean qualitatively new within living memory. I don't mean qualitatively new in history, because there's nothing that qualifies for that. But if you think back to, say, the 1990s, which is the last time that Delta Force was in action in South America, or I should say, the last time that we know Delta Force was in action in South America, when they went after Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel in Colombia. That was really a fundamentally different model of criminality that those cartels represented. And they certainly were malign actors. They did have a political agenda. They did commit terroristic acts, particularly in blowing up that Avianca flight that got Escobar into American crosshairs. But at the end of the day, they weren't, although they were corrupting and engaging in corruption with a variety of government officials, they really were not in partnership with the formal state as such. What they wanted was the formal state to get off their backs and not interfere with them. And that's a much more familiar pattern of criminality. It's one that exists in the United States with organized crime. It's one that's existed in Mexico for generations and generations. What has changed in the past generation is this emergence of the Estado de Narco, which is, I would describe it as this: it is a mutually beneficial partnership between the formal state and the criminal outfits themselves. And so you have this circular provision of goods. The cartels provide muscle for those that still go through democratic kind of kabuki. They provide muscle for that, and they also provide profit for the state, and they provide a deniable way, an indirect way, to wage what gets called fourth generation warfare against the enemies of that state, chief among whom is typically the United States. And then what the state provides to the cartels is essentially official cover. It's official cover. It's protection. It's protection by the armed forces. Certainly in the Venezuelan and Mexican cases. And so you see the synthesis emerge. And what ends up happening is, of course, civil society ends up breaking down. Venezuela was an extreme example of that. Mexico is on its way. And Mexico is about 15 years behind where Venezuela was, so there's still time to pull it back from the brink, probably, although it's pretty far gone. And what the Trump administration has done, I think very clearly, is declared that the United States, through the new application of the Roosevelt corollary and this new Trump corollary that we have, cannot tolerate the existence of this type of regime. And I think that's a very important point to bring forth. It's not just about Venezuela, and Venezuela is the end of the beginning. There are other estados de narco in the hemisphere, and they've been named by both the Secretary of State and the President. It's Cuba, it's Nicaragua, it's Mexico, it's elements of the Colombian state. So I think we're going to see more of this, and I think what we have to understand is this is a rollback operation that is seeking to restore a status quo ante that at minimum was manageable, certainly better than what we have now.
Yeah, that's interesting. It leads me to a follow-up, which is, of the previous regimes, I guess we could take the Medellin business as a jumping off point, the Pablo Escobar capture, or really killing, not capture.
Mhm.
I mean, how have the previous administrations fared in assessing and addressing this? How would you score, say, the George W. Bush, Obama, and Trump one Biden administrations on this? I know that's a big question, but
You want me to? You want? Well, what other kind of questions do we have?
who did? Yeah,
Look,
who did? Who? I guess we can start with who was the worst at this.
That's a great question. It was probably the Obama administration was the worst at it, which is plumbing the depths when you're worse than the Biden regime, right? But look, the Obama administration, I will tell you, and as you know, but for those of your listeners who don't, I'm really a Mexico specialist.
Yeah.
I've got, I know the region, but Mexico is my area of focus, because, like every Texan, I can't conceive of a world outside of my own personal experience. Obama lost an opportunity to correct the drift of the Mexican state into narco-state status when he and his Department of Justice killed an investigation. This is public record. Both ProPublica and the New York Times have written on this extensively. But the godfather of the Morena movement, which is the leftist party that now controls Mexican civics, his name is Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador. He was president of Mexico from 2018 to 2024. And he's really sort of the source of a lot of what's gone wrong in Mexico today. Around 2012, it was the Obama DOJ that killed the investigation into his links to the Sinaloa cartel. Had that investigation been pursued, we can imagine a much different outcome for Mexico and therefore for the United States, but it didn't happen. On the flip side of that, I would say a positive example is in kind of that time span that you named, Ryan, is George H.W. Bush. The one of the early examples of the Estado de Narco, of course, is Manuel Noriega's Panama, and that regime of his that lasted about a decade. When they crossed the line and started to threaten the security of the Panama Canal and actually mount direct attacks upon American military personnel in Panama, George H.W. Bush did what any self-respecting American chief executive would do, and he invaded and took over the entire country. And that's a positive example, and the willingness to use that hard power in pursuit of virtuous ends. And even in Panama, people will tell you it's not popular to endorse it. But everybody, on some level, will acknowledge that the American invasion there was a good thing, a positive thing. And Panama's been a reasonably well-governed democratic society ever since. That's the kind of leadership and willingness to apply hard power that American presidents have to be able to set forth and bring to bear in the Western Hemisphere and the Caribbean basin in particular. So I think those are the two poles. And if
Yeah.
you want, I can walk through each one of the presidents. But George H.W. Bush and his example on one end, which I think President Trump now has shown himself the equal to, and then Barack Obama on the lower end, and simply sitting back and letting the state cartel synthesis metastasize, and in the process drawing in the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians and all the other bad extra hemispheric actors that we now have to contend with in our
Yeah.
backyard.
What do you, to the extent that you have discerned it, what do you think was the primary motivating factor for the Obama administration's stifling the AMLO investigation? They thought he was someone they could deal with and was the least of all evils, or what was their motivation?
Well, I've puzzled on that to a great extent. I can tell you what I think it is.
Yeah,
And in all humility, I don't know directly because there's not documentary evidence that's public
yeah,
on it. American officialdom writ large, and this is true of both Democrats and Republicans, has kind of this historic, almost neurosis when it comes to Latin America in general and the Mexicans in particular. And the Mexicans understand this very well. It is a commonplace when you talk with Mexican officialdom or Mexican intellectuals of almost any stripe, that there's always the caution that the United States can't be too hard on Mexico because we'll hurt Mexico's feelings. And there's this history of U.S. intervention in Mexico, and we can't call up these very negative examples. Which it's always puzzled me a little bit because, of course, if you're American, they're all positive examples because we got the West out of it. It's sort of this perfect encapsulation to me of the inversion of proper values and proper statesmanship and proper stewardship of the nation that has kind of gripped our ruling class in the past generation or two. This idea that it's actually possible to advocate for the other country versus your own. And that has simply just taken root across a variety of spheres: State Department, Department of Defense, now war. The Trump administration is rooting it out. It's not completely rooted out in a variety of spheres, but it's certainly better than it's been since, I would say, the 1950s or so. But to your question, what I have read in the public record, and I suspect this is probably the case, is that the investigation into AMLO's receipt of Sinaloa and cartel money, which, by the way, he was very open about once he became president. So it's not, to me,
yeah.
it's not really in question at this point. Around 2012, it was killed specifically because it would be too disruptive to the relationship with Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
And that is such a that's just such a just a dereliction of understanding of what American governance is for. If Mexican governance is disrupted because a future president of Mexico is taking cartel money, our answer ought to be, so be it. The worst case scenario is that we're cut off from Mexico. I'm a South Texan, I'm half Mexican, and even I say, let that come, because it's preferable to the status quo that we have now.
Yeah, let's talk about the Iranian, Chinese, Russian part of this. Um, I don't know I don't know how much. I mean, what I'm relaying now, I've gotten from somewhat credible but mostly anonymous sources on Twitter, but those that have become reliable conveyors of such information over the years. And one thesis is that this was a huge blow to China in the sense that they had sold all of this long-range radar to Venezuela that should have stopped such an incursion from being undetected until the helicopters were over the palace and you could hear them down the street. And yet we seem to have flown past all of it without too much trouble. That would seem to be, and people have talked about it as a positive development, which should cause Beijing some pause in maybe its plans for Taiwan or its wider consideration of what to do about America or how to um, increasingly push our buttons or push the envelope or test our specific perimeters, as it were. And then what so, yeah, so what does this operation mean for Iran, Russia, and China in the region, do you think?
Yeah, I have spoken with some individuals who were, without betraying confidences, who were involved in I'll say some of the some of the conceptualization of
Yeah,
what happened on January 3rd. And to me, it is unquestionable that the more that we learn, this was a truly extraordinary operation from a standpoint of not just the personal bravery of the individuals involved, but also from a technical standpoint. And we shouldn't overlook the political bravery that was involved in giving the green light to this.
sure.
This was not a slam dunk decision by the president or the Secretary of War or anybody in the chain at all. This was a very, very known high risk operation. And when you think about really the only comparable U.S. military operation in recent history, which is the raid on Abbottabad that resulted in the death of Bin Laden. This was orders of magnitude more complicated and more fraught. Caracas is heavily defended terrain. I mean, there's hills, and it's not like Maduro's complex was on the beach. It wasn't. It was significantly inland. And then the decision to arrest him rather than to kill him. Now, if they decided to kill him, it would have been a drone strike, and there wouldn't have been anybody around
Yeah,
to do it. But instead, we probably had, this is just a guess on my part, dozens, if not a company's worth of Americans on the ground. And we know that they entered into direct combat with the Cubans, and the Cuban government has said that we killed about a platoon's worth of Cubans. By the way, the Cubans are 0 for 2 in direct combat with the United States now. In '83, all the Cuban construction workers in Grenada turned out to have crew-served weapons and tried to take on the U.S. Army Rangers, and they got dispersed there as well. So maybe third time will be the charm, and they'll stop trying. But we did it. We essentially, my understanding, which is imperfect, is that we essentially turned off the layered air defense system, which relied upon Chinese sensors and essentially Russian air defense batteries. And it's not that they were even defeated in combat; they simply didn't work. So there was no need to bomb them. I mean, there's a reason that there's a bunch of dead Cubans, not a bunch of dead Chinese and Russians. It's because we were able to turn off what the Chinese and Russians had. And I think, to your point, Ryan, that's got to complicate the calculus in places like Taiwan and elsewhere
yeah,
significantly. So we have demonstrated just tremendous operational and tactical excellence that is probably unmatched by any other military in the world. But of course, as we found out, certainly in the past century of American military history, that's only part of the puzzle. You have to have strategic and statecraft excellence as well, and that's been a missing element for some time.
Yeah, could you talk a little bit about the U.S. presence in Venezuela now? Trump famously said, we're running the country. Could you kind of guide, listeners through what specifically is the U.S. Objectives? What's our strategies kind of going forward in the short term and then in the long term too?
Yeah, a lot of this is still evolving. I can tell you how I interpret it now, and then your listeners can write in and say how wrong I was in a year. I think what the administration is doing is they are trying to correct rationally. They are trying to correct for a lot of the hubris that we saw in American interventions and occupations in the past 25 years. The American history of regime change, when you go back, say to 1945, is actually on the net positive side. But there was a difference that crept in the 1990s that I think went unremarked and really came back to hurt us on a strategic level, particularly once we got to the administration of George W. Bush. Think about when Douglas MacArthur lands in Japan in September 1945, and he does two things almost immediately. He retains the emperor, and essentially de facto grants him a pardon, not literally a pardon, but essentially a pardon for the fact that and the emperor was a war criminal, by the way. Let's be clear about this as Americans. But we did this for prudential reasons, and he retained the bulk of the Japanese civilian government. Very important point. And so the occupation forces governed through essentially an existing type of regime. Now, we did change it, but it wasn't what we saw 60 years later in Baghdad, where we fired the whole army, disbanded the Ba'ath Party, and then cast the state of Iraq to the winds, and thereby generated a decade's worth of insurgency that sapped American strategic strength. nor was it the same as what we saw in Afghanistan when we prevented the return of King Zahir Shah and actually refused a Taliban offer of surrender in 2001 because we preferred to wipe them out. So the sort of the post-Cold War arrogance that crept into American policymaking, I think, and I think this is an interpretation on my part. I just want to be clear. I think is what the Trump administration is correcting for now, and you can't gainsay them for it. There is a lot of criticism, and I too share some hesitation in reliance upon the Chavistas and the Maduristas who remain. Delcy Rodriguez is a bad person. There's no question about that. And there's even worse people underneath her. But can you blame the administration now for making the decision to not put boots on the ground in Venezuela, to loiter offshore with the Fourth Fleet, and to apply coercive measures to a regime that, although malevolent and malign, is putatively susceptible to the levers of hard power that we are demonstrably willing to use? That model deserves a chance to succeed, and I hope that it does. And then there's larger strategic questions. I don't want to go too far off field, but I'm happy to get into them as to kind of what our strategy vis-a-vis the South American continent in general is. But I'll stop there.
A lot of or a certain portion of the right who drew, I think, some conclusions that we share that you just voiced, Josh, about the imprudence of our conduct and our misinterpretation of the history of regime change, and the nature of political power and government transitions and revolutions, whether they be revolutions in offices, as Aristotle might call them, or revolutions in forms of government. Looking at Iraq, there's a certain portion of the right who says, oh no, another regime change war. The only way this is going to go is how the others went over the last 30 years, which is to say, very badly, and will inevitably draw us into a conflict that results in American lives lost and quagmire. But my one, in addition to your response, which you just voiced, which is they're taking a different approach, and they're taking, I think, a more traditional, running back the last few centuries approach to how you treat conquered powers, and the necessity for having someone on the ground who can run the place, even if some of them used to be bad people, or maybe even still are bad people, but are nonetheless behaving themselves because they have to, and know how to run a place, versus throwing the place into anarchy. I mean, the big difference in Venezuela is, these are different regimes, different cultures. I mean, Iraq was an Islamic state, held down by the Ba'ath Party, to be sure, but in super majority, to say the least, Islamist and Islamic. Whereas Venezuela is something very different, even as corrupted as it's been over decades of communist rule. So, I mean, the main difference, it seems to me, is that when you contemplate regime change, what form will it take? But you also have two very different types of regimes at play, and to work with. And your Japanese example is yet another iteration of that. So how should we understand? I mean, well, I'll put it this way: what would be Josh Trevino's ideal regime change in Venezuela, given the necessities on the ground?
Honestly, I think it would look a lot like what we're seeing now. I will confess I am of two minds on the Delcy Rodriguez question. I've gotten I won't claim to know her well, but I've gotten to know Maria Corina Machado, and whatever one may say about her strategic planning, and I understand there are critiques within government on that, and they may be correct. She is a deeply impressive and I think personally courageous individual, and so that as a Texan, that commands my sympathy to a great deal. But I think pulling the camera back, I am firmly convinced. I'm going to write on this at some point in the coming 30 days that the United States needs to be very conscious about its strategic use of force vis-a-vis the South American continent. I believe that we need to treat South America and continental South America. I don't mean the Caribbean basin. I mean South America itself, much as the British did prior to a lot of their strategic errors in the world wars, when they committed significant land power to their detriment on the European continent. That's not a revisionist take, by the way. I just want to be really clear. But it was objectively bad for Britain given the resources at its disposal. Our role in South America in terms of power projection needs to be offshore. We should dominate the Caribbean basin. We should have the Fourth Fleet maintain a permanent presence there. That's something that Congress actually ought to mandate through legislation. But beyond that, American boots on the continent of South America ought to be a rare event if it happens at all. We've got friends there who can do the work that needs to be done. And we also need to be very cognizant, and I can speak firsthand on this one, that there are elements in governance on that continent that very, very much want us on the continent because they believe, and I've been in conversations about this where this has been proposed, that the United States can lock down the Andes for them or bring order to the Amazon. And now look, they're being rational because there's a lot of American presidencies that would have done it. But that day has passed, I hope, permanently, and we need to be cognizant of it. So what would it look like? That's a good question that puts me on the spot correctly, Ryan, because as much of the critiques that I have, I don't have a better idea, honestly.
Yeah.
It's probably the best of all. It's the best worst option.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's given our conduct and our kind of totalizing approach in Iraq and Afghanistan, I think there's something to be said for taking steps, seeing what happens, and adapting to the circumstances, using, as you say, the overwhelming presence of hard power offshore as a leverage point. So I don't think that, I mean, I think maybe the most far-flung neocons would say that's somehow morally bankrupt, but I think the people who live in the real and realistic world of foreign policy will find this approach very familiar, even though we haven't conducted ourselves that way a lot in recent decades.
There's a cultural point that you mentioned this in passing, but I want to illuminate it for a second if I could. And the Secretary of State has talked about this as well. I think when he was ending the self-confidence of Margaret Brennan on Sunday morning. Latin America is not the Middle East. Islamic society writ large, whether it's Arab or Central Asian, in the case of Afghanistan, has, whatever critiques one may have of it, it has a ton of cultural coherence. It has a ton of cultural self-confidence, and it requires and seeks no reference to anything other than itself. It's very difficult for the United States of America, a descendant of the Anglo-conservative tradition, however attenuated, to walk into that and affect fundamental change. None of that's really true in Latin America. There's sort of this quiet debate that goes on within, as I say, Latin Americanist circles as to whether Latin America is part of the West writ large, and there's pretty good arguments pro and con on that. What I would say, though, is that it is enough part of the West, is sufficiently part of the West to be amenable to and attuned to a lot of our soft power, a lot of our political appeals, a lot of our values appeals in ways that Iraq and Afghanistan were never going to be. And so in that context, even though we properly stay offshore, we have a lot more political pull and cultural attractiveness than we ever would in other parts of the world. And we should leverage that.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I think that's a good place to stop. I know you're a busy guy. You've been all over media in recent days, but could you point folks to maybe a couple of your recent writings that might help them think through this?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I had a piece in National Review called "In Venezuela, the Era of Unaccountability is Over," and it draws 5 lessons from the raid on Caracas. So I'd point you to that. And then only because I have to orient us toward the Mexico problem, which is still the central problem of Latin America for the United States. I have a piece in the Wall Street Journal this morning noting that the Mexican regime has decided to side with the autocracies against the United States. And there should be consequences that flow from that, chief among them being that we should consider whether or not we ought to actually renew USMCA. So thanks for the opportunity, both of you.
Oh, of course. We're happy to have you on, Josh, and I suspect we may have you on again as we continue to, as the kids say on the internet, monitor the situation. But this has been useful, and we appreciate it. Well, now we're happy to have on for the second half of this podcast, R.J. Pestritto, a senior fellow of the Claremont Institute, the dean of the Van Andel Graduate School of Government at Hillsdale College, and he has a new provocation out for our Center for the American Way of Life, which is called Government by the Unelected, How It Happened and How It Might Be Tamed. we wanted to, this really has to do with the administrative state. For those who, longtime listeners, will know exactly what it's about from that title. RJ has been following this closely. He studied the intellectual roots of progressivism and the administrative state going back to at least the late 19th century in America, and is a student of, we thank him for doing this work so that we don't have to do all of it, a longtime student of the administrative law, the twists and turns of the administrative law around the administrative state. So we wanted to get a kind of preview from RJ about where this administration stands on this question of the bureaucracy, the measures it's taken to rein it in, what the courts have been up to. And I would direct everyone to go to AmericanMind.org and click on the features section. It is the lead feature at the moment with an opening piece from RJ, a kind of excerpt summary of sorts, synopsis of the provocation that he wrote for us, which you can get on Amazon and find in PDF form at dc.claremont.org. And then a couple of commentaries, but more coming, one from Myron Magnet and one from Brad Watson, another senior fellow of the Institute. And Brad works at the DC Hillsdale operation and teaches there. So, RJ, could you maybe set the scene for us? I know the close watchers of politics know about the executive orders that have to do with the Trump administration's approach to the administrative state, DOJ coming on the scene and trying to dig into some of the waste, fraud, and abuse emanating from the bureaucracy. I think last I checked, we've got a little under 300,000 federal bureaucrats downsized, that is, out of government. But where are we, and where should we hope to head?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. It's really kind of an extraordinary thing to watch, and the origin of this piece was Claremont sort of asking me to talk to its various fellows and interns over the course of these events as they were happening real time, and to try to translate a little bit, through the deception of the press, what really has been going on. And so, the administration's sort of pushback on the administrative state. The way I've tried to organize it is to say, it's sort of proceeding in three different ways after the initial kind of DOJ, highly publicized, move on parts of the federal budget, and a lot of the kind of most ridiculous examples of waste that we all saw. But as it sort of settled in, after the first couple of months, basically the idea was to try to, I think most importantly, try to reassert the control of the elected president over the bureaucracy. And as you know, and as many listeners will know, for many, many, many decades, Congress has worked hard to wall off increasing parts of the bureaucracy from the control of the elected president. We can talk about why and how that happened if you want. But the other effort has been to try to bring the regulatory process under the purview of the president by taking agencies, even those that had kind of been traditionally thought to be so-called independents. A lot of the alphabet soup agencies, the FTC, the SEC, agencies like that, to try to bring them under the purview of the president's executive office. And the way that any president or presidential administration sort of has its hand in the regulatory process is through the executive office of the president, through OMB, through OIRA, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. And what President Trump did, in addition to asserting his ability to hire and especially to fire the top officials at these agencies, is he issued an executive order which said all of these agencies, even if they're allegedly independent, anything they do, their regulations have to come through the executive office, have to come through OMB, have to come through OIRA. In other words, they have to be consistent with what the president wants, the president that the people voted for. And finally, of course, all of that is a way to take a serious look at the regulatory abuse of the last couple of Democratic administrations, and to try very hard to reverse as much of it as possible. And that is somewhat complicated because they tried it the first time around in the first term of the Trump administration, and basically got their doors blown off in court. Almost without exception, because there's a process, and there's a legal process, and it's complicated. And you mentioned that I have uh, the burden of learning a lot about administrative law, and it is a burden, but it's important to understand why this sometimes takes a little bit of time to do. So they've been hard at work on doing that the right way this time around. I think they're going at it much more intelligently, in a way that's much more likely to yield some success in court. So those would be the three major areas. You could expand on any of those or none of those, if whatever you wish.
Why don't we start with um, a sort of Claremont question, which is the real break, the principled or philosophical break affected by the progressive critique of the separation of powers. And I mean, it's now been over 100 years of this, although the modern alphabet soup agencies and their discretionary legislative authority and adjudicatory authority are maybe not quite 100 years old, almost 100 years old. I mean, I think the FTC statute is from the 20s. Is that right? Maybe even the teens.
It'd be 1913 if I'm not
13.
my history is my historian friends would laugh,
Yeah.
but I think 1913.
Yeah, I think it was the teens. I listened to the whole oral arguments in Trump v. Slaughter, and it was a nice primer on some of this stuff, but we can get to that later, maybe. This court case that they'll decide, we think, in June about the president's power to remove an FTC commissioner. But so one of the, I mean, to get back to Trump v. Slaughter, actually, the Slaughter's, some of the briefs around the appellant, that is this woman at the FTC, claim that, look, they didn't put it this way, but you Claremont people and all these critics of the administrative state, you claim that this was somehow something new, but come on. I mean, independent administration has been going on since pretty much the founding of the American government. How is that wrong, both in terms of how we think about government in a principled way and how the founders thought about it, and how maybe the progressives critiqued it and tried to change it or did change it?
Yeah, I mean, in one sense, it's certainly true that administration, and in fact, vigorous
Mhm.
national administration is, as old as the hills in this country, and everyone knows that Hamilton and the Federalists were no shrinking violets about national administrative power. The real question for the progressive, for the turn of the 20th century progressive fathers of the administrative state, was the problem of having administration accountable to political leadership. And they're coming on the heels of the kind of the civil service reform movement and the mugwump agitation for that, and the sort of the amateurism in the federal bureaucracy. And so the progressives kind of took that and turned that into a very comprehensive argument for an entirely new conception of government, where most of the functions of the federal government, the real governing, the real legislating, the real determining of winners and losers, and how the government would make rules, that needed to be moved out of the realm of politics, because after all, politicians were accountable to voters, and the progressives were very dreamy. They were very high on the power of education, on the power of university education, on the people who were kind of coming out of the universities. Woodrow Wilson, a great example, coming out of Princeton and sort of wondering in the 1880s, where's the place for educated people like me to make our mark in national affairs? And getting involved in ordinary politics was seen as, kind of demeaning in a way. And so there was a desire to give a place to people who had credentials. And so it's a whole new philosophy of government. Long story short, right?
Yeah.
The authority of consent. So even if you have vigorous national administration, which we have had going back to the founding, that is under and responsible to a Republican, small r Republican, an elected executive, and therefore it is constitutional and it is democratic as well as being Republican, and that loses its authority. Politics is corrupting. We need expertise, and so now the real claim to govern becomes one's education, one's level of expertise. And this is something that was birthed in the progressive era. We've seen it for decades and decades. It's got a big boost, obviously, coming out of the 1930s, and often a topic that puts people to sleep until we got the COVID pandemic, and then it was much easier for people to get a feel for what it meant that their elected officials were sort of sidelined,
Mm-hmm.
and that alleged experts, people in the white coats, were put in positions of authority over their lives, and to see to be able to test the legitimacy of claims, right, of expertise. I think so. That's a sort of history of it. It's a very, as you said, a very Claremont-y kind of topic. We've been on the origins of this, as you know, long before COVID. So.
Yeah, it's as our colleague John Marini has argued, it's the transformation goes a lot deeper than I think normal Americans or even most politicians appreciate. I mean, the world in which they live is a world where the authority is the credential, it is the expert. They can complain about it in Congress all they want, but in the popular media, which is often downstream from the kind of university culture, the priests of this new or now not so new way of doing government or new science of government are really, as you mentioned, resident in the modern university system, which was kind of a new thing after the Civil War, at least in America, and we've lived with it ever since. But really, you can't undertake anything with any real legitimate moral or policy legitimacy in America these days in most instances, unless you have, studies behind you and experts who've demonstrated that this is good, rather than the older way of doing government, which you talked about, which was, the rule by consent, which was the people exercising their consent through their elected representatives. And I think we're just beginning maybe to appreciate, and you rightly said that COVID was a big catalyst for this, appreciate the extent to which there's something wrong with this picture. But most people don't appreciate how deep this water is and how long we've been swimming in it,
Yeah, and Ryan, if I could just add briefly, I think one of
Yeah.
the things that COVID sort of helped to explain why it is that now, and this is a relatively recent development, that elected politicians on the left basically are willing to cede control to the bureaucrats, because it used to be. I mean, the big problem here is that Congress no longer legislates. The administrative state is a creation of Congress, and Congress has been content to let the administrators govern for them. But it used to be the case that Congress would always want its prerogatives protected and respected. And so, if you were an agency administrator, you really didn't want to get hauled before a congressional committee, because regardless of party, you would be scrutinized, and they would want you to come up and kiss the ring. Nowadays, that's simply not true anymore. And it's because that you have one party in Congress, the Democratic Party, understands that the administrators are their proxies. They understand that that ideologically the administrative state is progressive. It's left. This is my big pushback against some of our conservative friends who think, well, we can take over the administrative state and then we'll run it in a conservative way. It actually doesn't work that way. The Democrats understand that, and so they're perfectly content now to sit back in Congress and to allow administrators to run roughshod over the prerogatives of Congress, even though they're in Congress. And you saw that in COVID, right? When the electoral branches kind of got pushed to the sidelines, you got the most progressive kinds of regulation. So that's a relatively new development, new meaning in the last 20 or 30 years, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we saw it on display, of course, in the maybe most dramatically in the shifting arguments about public health and large gatherings when the twin event of George Floyd's demise and the BLM riots happened. And, it was now a matter of public health to have crowds out in the streets, even though, 2 days prior, a bunch of people within 6 feet of each other, let alone that rule being arbitrary, leave that aside, was actually against public health. So I think that was a real mask off moment for people.
The signs were there. If you go back to the hearings on the persecution of conservative organizations, when the IRS was doing that,
Lois
remember
Lerner and all that.
they brought Lois Lerner in and Koskinen and they got up there in front of that committee and told members of Congress basically to, you know what, get lost.
Yeah.
And the Democrats just sat there and did nothing. And if they had tried to pull that stunt 10 or 20 years before that, there would have been, I think, members on both sides of the aisle who would have insisted that at least a show be made of respecting, the prerogatives of Congress, and that was just gone at that point. The regulator, that was a signal to the regulators. Hey, we know you're doing our work. We're not going to institutionally insert ourselves into your business.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in the piece you wrote for The American Mind, the shorter piece, you talked about obviously what President Trump has done, nominating judges, some of the executive orders. You talk about obviously what the court itself is doing. It looks like with the Slaughter case that Humphrey's executor, the 1935 case, the infamous case, might finally be overturned. What hope is there for Congress actually themselves doing anything to reassert their own power that they've delegated away?
Yeah, it's a great question. The way I put it in the piece is there's sort of three ways I think that the administrative state can be and must be controlled. One is that the courts actually start enforcing the Constitution, realize that having an insulated fourth branch of government with lots of power is not actually constitutional. So that'd be one way. There's been some modest progress on that in recent years. And so the Trump administration is trying to take advantage of that now. Second way is for the elected president to reassert his control over the executive branch. The Constitution only grants power to the president, not to anyone else. And so he has to be able to hire and fire his subordinates, or he doesn't have the executive power as his Constitution required. And you've seen the Trump administration is vigorously pursuing that as well. But the third way to control the administrative state is, of course, to go back to its creator, Congress. That yes, the president is the people's elected representative, but Congress is full of the people's elected representatives, and they too are supposed to exert the people's democratic consent over the administration. They have given that duty away. I am, as I say in the piece, extremely skeptical on either side of the political aisle. I regret to say that they will try to reclaim that. And that's why I think as a prudential matter, I don't necessarily think it's all for the good that everything here is going through the president, but the president is at least elected. And so if the elected Congress won't do its job, then certainly the elected president needs to do his. And I think one great way of framing this is I saw it. I think it was Randy Barnett had a very nice comment when the Slaughter case was argued. He said, people are complaining that this is all about transferring power, transferring more power to the president. And Barnett said yes, and the question is transferring it from whom? Right. From people who are not elected, who are not consented to. And so Congress has done that. And I think the only immediate way to try to beat back the administrative state is through their elected president. Whether or not that's sufficient, I don't know. I just hold very little hope out for Congress doing its job.
If they were to get their act together, RJ, would it look something like a much expanded and probably better compensated staffing operation in Congress to have, I mean, those of us who've been studying this for a long time, I mean, Congress is, it's not exclusively filled with a bunch of young staffers who don't know too much, but that's a lot of it. There are plenty of senior staffers, especially on the committees, but they really are outgunned by the administrative state. Uh, and can be completely run circles around in terms of expertise and all of that. Would the ideal world at some point in the future, should Congress develop a backbone and start to really dig into this, the repossession of a lot of this legislative and rulemaking authority back into Congress, which would mean a pretty expanded staffing operation, accountable to members of Congress? Is that and a rebalancing of sorts of the separation of powers? As you say, if the liberals are complaining, and you saw it in the Trump v. Slaughter arguments about this vast regulatory and rulemaking apparatus now under the control of the president, the solution seems to me to be, a much bigger Congress, not in the sense of more members necessarily, although that might be a reform that's worth doing in the House, but really a beefing up of the capacity of Congress to oversee what is essentially legislation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have to bear in mind this is not an argument that we're making that legislation should be made without facts or
Right.
without access to expertise. When the expertise is genuine, by the way, and not
Yeah.
ideologically compromised, that's a huge caveat, of course. But of course, legislators should listen to to experts. They should know the facts. They should know if they vote yes, one scenario may be very likely to happen, and if they vote no, a different scenario may be very likely to happen. Like, that's really relevant information. But there's no reason they can't be provided that before they vote.
Right.
That is to say, why the expertise cannot be brought over into the legislative branch, but that ultimately the enacting power, the enacting agent, is the people through their elected representative. Whereas we know that one of the reasons why all of this alleged expertise has been put over into the, not really even in the executive branch, into this sort of fourth branch entity, is precisely because it immunizes those legislators from accountability to the voters whom they're supposed to represent. That's why it's over there. And what we're left with today is, Congress as a kind of, I don't know, a media platforming outfit, that can't even, I mean, we're still running off of the Biden budgets, even though we have Republican majorities. I mean, this is not promising.
Yeah, and to really get a handle on it, you would need, I mean, I leave to the current and future statesmen to figure out how to make this case, but you would need, and this has been one of my themes for a decade at least when I talk publicly about it. I mean, neither of these parties has really addressed this issue or run on it in an explicit way and won a durable majority to do something about it one way or the other. So you would need, I think, public arguments, maybe emanating from a presidential candidate, probably inevitably emanating from a presidential candidate after Trump, to take up this issue, to help Congress and new Congress people get elected on this platform, to really affect these big reforms. You'd need something like not a supermajority, but a durable realigning majority, right? And
Yeah, I think
not a 6 vote, edge in the House.
no, and even in the Senate, right?
Yeah.
There aren't. I mean, I look. There are very good people in both of these chambers. I mean, we know that, but just there simply are not enough of them.
Mhm.
And I think one, if you want a note of hope, I have a tendency to depress people, of course. But one note of hope is it's now clear that some in Congress are at least waking up to the fact that they've given the executive a lot of power. They didn't seem to mind that if that meant, some random agency But now that it's Donald Trump retaking that power, which is his constitutional right and duty, by the way. But now that it's holy cow, look at this power we've given to the president. A really good example of this are the tariffs, right? This is something that's also pending before the court, whether or not the president being able to enact these tariffs, is both lawful and constitutional. And I mean, it's, there are different legal opinions on this. I think the current law he's using maybe isn't as good as other ones he could use. But the point being, Congress has given him this power. I mean, if this tariff regime gets shut down, he's got other laws he can go to. And it's just evidence of what Congress has given the president. So, maybe the fact that not only this power is being reclaimed by the president, but is being reclaimed by, Satan himself, Pol Pot, Hitler, and Stalin all combined into one, and Donald Trump, as they like to describe him. Maybe that's some kind of wake up call. I don't know. That's about as hopeful as I could get on Congress.
Yeah. Let's just end with Trump v. Slaughter. You mentioned the tariff case. I should note for everyone who will probably hear this on Thursday. On Friday, it looks like we're going to get an opinion on the tariffs case. Maybe they're going to hand something down. I think it's I don't know if it's totally confirmed, but it's expected that they're going to rule on the tariff case on Friday. So that'll be interesting to watch. But this case, Trump v. Slaughter, which we have barely discussed, it's just want to lay out the facts for people real quick. It's a worthy successor case to the original case from 1935, which Mike mentioned, Humphrey's Executor, which had to do with FDR trying to remove a federal trade commissioner who died in the interim. So it was the executor of his estate trying to recoup his wages. That gave us the case. And the question was, can FTC members be insulated from presidential removal? And the court ruled yes. And we've sort of lived under that regime since. It's been modified and it's been chipped away at, especially by the Roberts Court over the last 15 years or so. But now the question is acute, and it looks like we have a court majority at 6-3 or at least 5-4 to overturn that case. The question is, I suspect, RJ, that you predict that it will be overturned in some fashion, but can you read some tea leaves for us? What do you think this result may look like or is likely to look like under Roberts' supervision? Expect him to write it and hold his majority together.
Yeah, I think Roberts will write it. I think there will be 6 votes for it. I think they will overturn Humphrey's Executor. One of the reasons why the Trump administration has been pursuing this course is there are a lot of smart people who were there in the interregnum watching the signals from the Roberts Court. And so, when there were firings of officials at some other agencies, and it looked like maybe the Roberts Court would say, well, we're going to allow those, but we'll try to keep Humphreys alive. So they made sure to go, no, we're going to fire somebody from the FTC. So there, you have to address Humphrey's Executor, which is about the FTC. I think that in sort of vintage Roberts incrementalist fashion, there'll be some attempt to try to kind of incoherently wall off certain sacred cows within the administrative state, most notably the Federal Reserve. They've already given some signal that they may try to do certain carve outs, and this is very much how things typically go in the Roberts Court. So we may see that. But the decision itself, I mean, to go back to Humphrey's Executor, I think the important thing to understand is that it was the protection for an agency like the FTC came on top of the court basic. The way the court did it is to say, okay, because Congress has given to the executive not an executive power, but some legislative and judicial power. Because it's done that, then it's acceptable for the president to be shielded in his control, or to be restricted, I should say, in his control over this agency. And so they double down on a constitutional barbarity, essentially. They say, well, because Congress can give legislative and judicial powers to the executive, that's barbarity number one. Then, barbarity number two, the president can be denied control over people who are supposed to be subordinate to him in the executive branch.
Mm.
So it's the worst Supreme Court decision other than Dred Scott in the history of the country. It was a unanimous decision.
Mm-hmm.
And ironically, because you had the progressives on the court, of course, but also you had those on the court who wanted to, they thought they were striking a blow against FDR.
Right.
Because FDR wanted to fire this guy. And so even the conservatives went along. And so it was a unanimous ruling. And just really, as you say, has kind of been an embarrassment in the subsequent decades. And they've finally been chipping away at it.
Including 4 members, I think. I mean, Taft was dead already, the author of the 1926 case, Myers v. U.S., which said that superior officers, at least, and we don't need to get into those details, but executive officers had to be removable, including a postmaster, which was a case in, which was the impetus for the case in Myers. And 4 of that 5-person majority in Myers was on the court, including George Sutherland, the great defender of constitutionalism, separation of powers, and property rights, and all the rest, who signed off on Humphrey's executor. So yeah, it's an interesting historical example of a partisan leanings and worries.
And also very short. If you compare the opinion in Humphreys
Oh yeah,
to the one in Myers, right? Humphreys is a short, sort of thrown together, poorly reasoned, whatever you think of it otherwise. Myers is a tour de force.
115 pages. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, it's good. Yeah, it's it'll be one to watch. I think Spencer and I are going to do a deep dive on all of this, and I'm going to draw a bit on some of the work your colleague Joe Postel has done on this. Some good historical work on this question of administrative power and how it's evolved over the years, and so people can look forward to that. But they should all also keep an eye out for that last week in June, which I suspect is when we'll get this Trump v. Slaughter ruling. And I encourage everyone, which I have in the past, uh, these court opinions can be a bit long. They look longer than they are because they're on kind of high margin paper and they've got tons of footnotes, but they are meant to be read by the general public. And I think at least good portions of them will be profitable for those who are interested in this topic. So keep an eye out for it and actually read the opinions, especially the concurring opinions by our favorite justices like Alito and Thomas. And on this question, I think maybe Gorsuch, if not Kavanaugh. We'll see. Well, thanks, RJ. I encourage everyone to go to, as I mentioned, go to dc.claremont.org, go to the little, drop-down hamburger menu on the left and click on provocations. You can see RJ's full provocation there. Read the feature at the American Mind. And this is a question that's a live one and will continue to roll through this administration. And I think whatever the level of convolution that emerges from Chief Justice Roberts' pen, and I agree with RJ that it will be somewhat convoluted and maybe not totally logically consistent. It will, I think, be a great blow struck against this system of government we've lived under now for the better part of a century, and the benefits for the American people and their liberties will be, I think, substantial, especially as we have an executive who starts to act on it even more aggressively after the ruling. So thanks for joining us, RJ. And everyone should keep an eye out for the new entries in the feature, which Mike Sabo here with us is overseeing at the American Mind. Thank you all once again for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to learn more about our work, of course, go to www.claremont.org. If you'd like to support our work, go to claremont.org/donate. Go to, as I just mentioned, dc.claremont.org for the latest from our Center for the American Way of Life. Go to our 2 publications, as always, americanmind.org for our digital publication, new pieces every week, and ClaremontReviewBooks.com. I will flog again the latest and greatest issue of the Claremont Review Books, a double 25th anniversary issue full of good stuff. And thanks, as always, to our production and engineering team, Ryan and Jake Gannon. Although Ryan is derelict this week, he's out on vacation. A horrible dereliction of duty. I'm just kidding, Ryan, but thanks, Jake, for stepping in for Ryan. And we thank you all for listening, and we will talk to you all next week.